Right, okay, welcome back. Our next speaker is Jimmy Lenman, who is an ethicist and the author of papers with such titles as Utilitarianism and Obviousness, Consequentialism and Cluelessness, Michael Smith and the Daleks, and most recently, Uggles and Muggles. But perhaps more pertinently to this conference, he's also the author of Achieving Objectivity, Against Moral Fictionalism, and Naturalism Without Tears. Jimmy's paper this afternoon is entitled Science, Ethics and Observation.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Harvey and Marion for inviting me. It's nice to be here. I think in recent years, can you hear me if I'm sitting down? Yeah. In recent years, I've probably become a bit narrowly established in the moral philosophy conference circuit, and so I've kind of come to sort of get used to coming across the same 40 people at every conference I go to, and it's nice to be here and to realise that there are actually other people apart from those people. This is, when Harvey invited me, it was still the original title, Phenomenology and Naturalism, and I pointed out to her that although I know a little bit about naturalism, I don't really know anything about phenomenology, but she still wanted me, so here I am. I say I don't know anything about phenomenology, although in fact in the analytical literature on metaethics, people do toss the word around, but it's used with a very small p. It has nothing to do with Husserl or Heidegger, and it's really just a rather pretentious way of saying experience. In that sense, there will be some phenomenology in this, but not with a capital P. Okay, so in 2007, I published a paper in the joint session proceedings called What is Moral Inquiry? And that paper contained a rather preposterously long, 628 words long footnote, in which I made some rather sketchy and hand-wavy remarks about a species of moral naturalism. 628 words was on the long side for a footnote, but what I said was still far too sketchy and hand-wavy to do the topic justice. So this paper is in effect that footnote rather substantially expanded. I still don't think I do the topic justice, but I hope I do it more justice. A good sermon needs a text, and my text is the following quotation. This is from Richard Boyd. Of the challenges to moral realism we're considering, two are straightforwardly epistemological. They suggest that the role of moral intuitions and of reflective equilibrium dictate at best a constructivist interpretation of morals. As we saw in section 4.2, it would be possible for the moral realist to respond by assimilating the role of moral intuitions and theory to the role of scientific intuitions and theory-dependent methodological factors in the realist account of scientific knowledge. But this response is viable only if it's possible to portray many of our background moral beliefs and judgments as relevantly, approximately true, and only if there is a satisfactory answer to the question, what plays in moral reasoning the role played in science by observation? Let us turn first to that question. The question, what plays in moral reasoning the role played in science by observation? I propose the answer, observation. That's the proposal I want to talk about. The text I'm quoting is Boyd's famous 1988 essay, How to Be a Moral Realist, which is a classic manifesto of what came to be known as Cornell realism in ethics. But more on that story later. After all, Cornell realism is quite old news. It's all rather 1980s. Now, as the new century lurches towards its difficult teens, the latest thing is experimental ethics. After centuries of arid lack of progress in moral philosophy, we're told, Our understanding of ethics is in the course of being transformed by new insights from experimental psychology and neurology, or so it is widely claimed. This produces some interesting interdisciplinary possibilities. I think it's fair to say, too, that it may produce some interesting anti-disciplinary possibilities, insofar as I think it's fair to say that some of the brasher and more confident of the experimentalists conceive the future relationship between these empirical sciences and traditional moral philosophy less along the lines of a partnership and more along the lines of a takeover bid. The days of arid armchair theorizing are at an end. Ethics is off to the lab. Of course, there's a tradition in moral philosophy that says this simply cannot be right. And that's the tradition broadly comprising those who are impressed by Hume's famous observations about the impossibility of deriving an ought from an is, and of course by the arguments against reductive naturalism aired by such influential philosophers as G.E. Moore and R.M. Hare. The new experimentalists standardly complain that these arguments are fallacious, but I'm not really going to concern myself here with adding to the oceans and oceans of ink already spilt adjudicating that question. I'm going to begin by focusing on a recent addition to the more popular and polemical side of the experimentalist literature. Boyd is really damn hard, so it's a good warm-up to start with something a bit easier. Sam Harris's recent book, The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values. Note the subtitle. How science can determine human values, not influence, not inform. Harris is very much a takeover bid man. Like Boyd, he's out to defend an extremely robust form of naturalistic moral realism. Moral questions, he tells us, have answers, and it is an entirely empirical matter, a matter for natural science, in particular he thinks for neurology, what these answers are. A takeover bid man, then. Indeed, he makes it rather clear that philosophy isn't his favourite subject. He writes in a footnote, "I'm convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, emotivism, etc. directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe." I don't quote this to an audience mainly comprising philosophers so we can be offended by it or so that we can sneer knowingly at it. It's actually, I think, perfectly true that a vast amount of modern moral philosophy is breathtakingly boring. But it's no less true that all of it is not. These things are matters of taste, but I think anyone who's bored by the impressively jargon-free writings of, say, Judy Thompson or Bernard Williams must be someone who is simply not interested in the subject at all, from whatever disciplinary perspective. Harris's low regard for philosophy may account for the frequently imperfect knowledge of philosophy that is often on display. Perhaps the most egregious example comes right up front on page 2, where he tells us that the goal of this book is to begin a conversation about how moral truth can be understood in the context of science. The goal of this book is to begin a conversation about how moral truth can be understood in the context of science. Of course, that's a very odd claim. Begin a conversation? Really? Obviously, the conversation, and a very lively conversation it's been about how moral truth can be understood in the context of science, has been going on now for a very long time, and Harris has joined it at a very late point. And one of the least impressive things, I think, about the experimentalists is that a lot of them do seem to believe that people interested in ethics taking an interest in experimental empirical data is something that's been happening for about the last 10 minutes of philosophical history. That could not be more false, as anyone who knows the history of certainly 20th century ethics could confirm. Harris's disparaging view of moral philosophy is puzzling for a further reason. He wants to claim that ethics is entirely a matter of empirical science, and in particular neuroscience, and he is himself a neuroscientist by training. But there actually isn't very much neuroscience in his book, and rather a lot of what can only be described as moral philosophy. A central philosophical agenda of Harris's is a defence of utilitarianism. He thinks, as I've mentioned, that there are answers to moral questions, and he thinks these answers are all about human well-being. The arguments that he uses to defend utilitarianism are actually rather familiar, although he doesn't show much recognition of their having a history. So he follows Mill in urging repeatedly that apparent conflicts between a utilitarian understanding of morality and other important, apparently non-utilitarian values can be largely mitigated by insisting on an understanding of human well-being that is sufficiently rich and deep. And he follows Ross and others in his heavy reliance on the kind of thought experiments where we say seek to illuminate and defend the intuitive intrinsic value of well-being by, for example, comparing in imagination a world where everyone is happy with a world where everyone is miserable. Think of a world where everyone's happy. Think of a world where everyone's miserable. Obviously the first world's better, so utilitarianism is true. Well, not quite. The most that will establish is that well-being is at least one of the things that we should value, and not that it's the whole story of what is valuable, and that's a conclusion that falls some way short of utilitarianism. In deploying such arguments, Harris appeals constantly to moral intuition. Many experimentalists have been in various ways disparaging about moral intuition, but he's pretty upfront about his reliance on it. Well, he writes, while moral realism and consequentialism have both come under pressure in philosophical circles, they have the virtue of corresponding to many of our intuitions about how the world works. And of course, the imaginative comparison arguments rely wholly on intuition. But he doesn't tell us much about how he thinks this works. And sometimes he is sceptical about it in the same spirit as his fellow experimentalists, telling us, for example, on page 36, that just as we all have an intuitive physics, much of which rigorous scientific investigation has shown us to be rubbish, likewise we each have an intuitive morality, much of which is once again clearly wrong. But his utilitarianism is clearly grounded in appeals to intuitions in which he clearly does repose considerable trust, inviting the question, how exactly does he think he is able to sort the wheat from the chaff? Talk of intuitions about how the world works makes it sound as if Harris has in mind something more robustly substantive than appeal to linguistic intuitions of the kind that might be at play in conceptual analysis. But there seems to be data against that reading, insofar as much of the time he talks as if something like conceptual analysis must be what he's up to. Thus he claims that to contest utilitarianism is, quote, to misuse words. He tells us that well-being is the only intelligible basis for morality, that disconnected from experience, talk of value is empty, that the connection between what is interesting and the experience of conscious beings, or that between what is important and well-being, that these connections hold by definition. Most striking of all, if I can briefly break an earlier self-denying ordinance, but only very briefly, is his short skirmish with Moore's open question argument against naturalism, where he writes this: if we define good as that which supports well-being, as I will argue we must, the regress initiated by More's open question argument really does stop. While I agree with More that it's reasonable to wonder whether maximising pleasure in any given instance is good, it makes no sense at all to ask whether maximising well-being is good. It seems clear that what we are really asking when we wonder whether a certain state of pleasure is good is whether it is conducive to or obstructive of some deeper form of well-being. If you say so. Such passages might suggest we are engaged in a kind of conceptual analysis and the basic intuitions at play seem to be linguistic, but I think that would be misleading if we look at other things, he says. Because Harris happily allows that it's quite open to people who have different goals to ours and different moral commitments to ours to define these words in different ways. I might claim, quoting again, I might claim that morality is really about maximising well-being, but someone else will be free to say that morality depends on worshipping the gods of the Aztecs. This Aztec has his own definition, reflecting his own goals. We have ours, and we might doubt if ours has any special privilege. We might indeed, says Harris. Is it possible to voice such doubts in human speech? Yes, but that doesn't mean, he says, we should take them seriously. So it looks as if this isn't quite an issue about intelligibility. We define the concepts one way, given our goals. Strange and alien creatures might define them differently, given theirs. We understand what they're doing, but we shouldn't take it seriously. But what's the force of that claim? And here Harris seems simply to balk. To press further at this point, he thinks, would be an absurd and unreasonable demand for what he calls radical justification. He backs this up with certain analogies. Health is the goal of medicine, and health itself we maybe define in terms of certain goals, longevity, freedom from pain, and so on. Questioning or justifying these goals is no business of medicine. Science, likewise, is defined, he says, with reference to a certain goal, that of understanding the universe. But it's not a scientific issue whether this goal is correct or justified. Nonetheless, that's no reason to question it or to take rival goals seriously. Quoting again, we might observe that standard science is better at predicting the behaviour of matter than creationist science is. But what could we say to a scientist whose only goal is to authenticate the word of God? Here we seem to reach an impasse. And yet no one thinks that the failure of standard science to silence all possible has any significance whatsoever. Why should we demand more of a science of morality? Okay, but as a case for a robustly naturalistic version of moral realism, this ain't fabulously impressive. You know what, if Dr. Crazy wants to redefine the practice of medicine, not in terms of its traditional goal of promoting health, but in terms of some new goal, say the goal of maximising the number of malignant cancer cells in the world, no one will take him seriously. Of course no one will take him seriously. Why will no one take him seriously? Well, we can surely explain that without supposing that there are objective, naturalistic moral truths that underwrite our goals, our favoured definition, and not his. It's enough surely that our goals are ours, and his are not ours. Given that, all we need then is simple instrumental reasoning. Given that our goal is health, let's encourage everyone to eat their greens, and doing that is just doing medicine. Or think of Professor Crazy, who wants to abandon science, defined as trying to understand the universe, and redeploy all the resources devoted to that to some other bonkers goal. Again, we'll object. Why will we object? Well, because we are curious animals and we care about understanding the universe. So we just ignore Professor Crazy and get on with our science. But to do that, we don't need to rely on any supposition that our goals find an echo in some normative reality that his do not. Once again, they motivate us as his do not because they are ours and his are not. Now suppose this. Suppose we have settled to our perfect satisfaction that utilitarianism is true. Suppose, in other words, we have, to all intents and purposes, finished doing normative ethics. We have arrived at the end of inquiry, in a shared and stable state of reflective equilibrium, and the utilitarians have won. We now know that all that matters is determining what particular actions or what general policies will best promote well-being. Doing that is a new kind of inquiry that won't look much like moral philosophy. It will be straightforward scientific inquiry of perhaps familiar kinds. I guess much of it would look like, indeed would be, economics. Some of it would be medicine. According to Harris, a lot of it would be neuroscience. Ethics, the investigation of what is good and right, if we still feel like calling these as it were successor disciplines, ethics would then be thoroughly naturalized. My hunch is that Harris thinks that is really where we are. Of course, there are loads of people out there who are not utilitarians, and the argument continues to rage between the utilitarian likes of Peter Singer and the non-consequentialist likes of Francis Cam or Judith Thomson. But the mere sociological fact that an argument is still going on needn't show that it isn't, in an important sense, over. Harris is preoccupied with the conflict between science and religion, so it might be apt to compare the dispute between, on the one hand, young Earth creationists who believe all living species came into being separately in distinct acts of creation about 6,000 years ago, and those of us who believe we are the product of a long process of branching evolutionary development from a common ancestry over many, many millions of years. Sociologically speaking, that argument is still going on. There are still people around making the case for both sides of it, but there's another sense in which it's over. The creationists have lost. Like Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense, these guys just don't know they're dead. They won't shut up, but most of us feel abundantly warranted in not taking them seriously. My hunch that Harris thinks ethics is like that he thinks the same is true about utilitarianism's opponents. I suspect he thinks, as many people I think mistakenly do, that for anyone with a naturalistic mindset, anyone imbued with what people like Russell used to call the scientific spirit, for anyone like that, the truth of something like utilitarianism is just a no-brainer. Where rival views, deontological and other views, are really just hangovers from a disreputably atavistic and superstitious past. Irrational nonsense we should simply grow up and shrug off. Strikingly here, Harris is happy to embrace a move that is sometimes aired by way of an intended reductio of moral naturalism. If a thoroughgoing naturalism of this kind is true, why not simply abandon our moral concepts that seem to speak of a distinctive domain of moral properties and simply speak in overtly naturalistic terms of the naturalistic properties with which we've identified them? Harris' response, yeah, why not? What would it be like if we ceased to worry about right and wrong, or good and evil, and simply acted so as to maximize well-being, our own and that of others? Would we lose any importance? And if important, wouldn't it be, by definition, there he goes again, a matter of someone's well-being? On Harris's terms, that's fair enough. If we were at the end of inquiry, that would be fair enough. As I've argued elsewhere, have I argued? I've said it in a very persuasive tone of voice, which is almost as good. As I've argued elsewhere, that the fundamental point of normative concepts is to negotiate conflict, intrapersonal and interpersonal, over practical matters, conflicts over what to do. If we found ourselves beyond such conflicts, in a position where all normative argument was at an end, that we were all agreed on what our practical priorities ought to be, we could pretty well give up normative thinking altogether, drop such words as ought and right from our language, and just get on with the serious business of pursuing the good under the guidance of our best science. That much is fair enough. The only small problem, of course, is that it really is simply a fantasy that is where we are, or anywhere like where we are. And I think nothing Harris has to say in his book amounts to any kind of case to suppose otherwise. Okay, that's me done with Harris. End of warm-up. I'm now ready to return to Boyd, who's a rather trickier proposition. Boyd, remember, is concerned that his moral realism, a moral realism that depends on assimilating the role of moral intuitions in theory to the role of scientific intuitions in theory, he thinks that's only going to work. That assimilation of moral intuitions in theory to scientific intuitions in theory will only work if there is a satisfactory answer to the question, what plays in moral reasoning the role played in science by observation? Boyd thinks that question has a satisfactory answer, and that answer is observation. A bold and interesting claim. It's worth being clear about why Boyd should suppose this question is important, why he thinks he needs to answer it. He's concerned with assimilating the role of intuitions in theory in the moral and scientific cases. Take intuition. Many people, of course, will say that a controlling role in our moral reasoning, analogous to that of observation in science, is played by intuition itself. But those people tend not to be naturalistic moral realists, and the puzzle they face is explaining how that's supposed to work. Boyd thinks it's easy to explain how moral intuition is supposed to work. It works in the same way intuition works in science. And he thinks intuition does indeed play a considerable role in science. But intuitions in science do not play the central, grounding, confirmatory role that they're supposed by some to play in ethics. They don't, according to a naturalist like Boyd, furnish us with a priori moral knowledge, a priori scientific knowledge in the scientific case. They don't supply us with non-inferential knowledge. A distinguished and experienced professor of chemistry may have intuitions, hunches about chemistry. Presented with novel chemical hypotheses, some will strike him as plausible, others less so. I too might have such hunches about chemistry, and so might a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. But the professor's hunches are worth a very great deal more than mine, and mine perhaps are worth a bit more than my Stone Age ancestors. What makes the difference is scientific training and experience. Judgments of theoretical plausibility made by a trained mind are, Boyd urges, evidential. But they're not a priori and they're not non-inferential. Rather, they're based on years of scientific education and experience that serve to inform them, even though the inferential routes by which they are reached are not, as it were, phenomenologically transparent to the expert subject. Based as they are on scientific training, they can be taken seriously and have a role to play, an important role in the direction of scientific thought. But for this to be true, the theoretical knowledge that underlies them must enjoy a sufficient measure of confirmation to be regarded as probably and approximately true. And the ideas to which they lead us cannot rest forever on this merely intuitive support, but must themselves in turn seek more robust forms of confirmation. So it's only because observation is playing the controlling role it does in confirmation that intuition can legitimately play the role it does in theory construction. So if moral intuitions are to share a vindication with scientific ones, and it's not just further intuitions playing the controlling role, we need an answer to Boyd's question. And as I say, his answer is observation. Let me put a little flesh on Boyd's view. Here, as well as drawing on his 1988 paper, I'll also draw on its sequels, published in 2003 in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, with the not terribly snappy titles, Finite Beings, Finite Goods, The Semantics, Metaphysics and Ethics of Naturalistic Consequentialism, Part 1, and Finite Beings, Finite Goods, The Semantics, Metaphysics and Ethics of Naturalistic Consequentialism, Part 2. As the latter titles imply, Boyd too is a consequentialist. He's indeed a welfarist, and hence, like Harris, a utilitarian. His name for his view is homeostatic consequentialism, hereafter HC. According to homeostatic consequentialism, good denotes a complex cluster of natural properties relating to the satisfaction of human needs, where the clustering in question is a product of homeostasis, i.e., very, very roughly, each of the properties in question tends to be favourable to the presence of the others. Goodness, so understood, he thinks is a natural kind term in virtue of this cluster property's causal role. We don't know this by conceptual analysis, he thinks, but a posteriori by doing moral theory. What makes this stuff goodness is that it plays a regulative causal role in our theoretical practice, with the concept of goodness in a way that explains the success of that practice, much as with more familiar scientific natural kind terms. The property determines, gives the meaning of the word good. What fixes the reference is the concept's reference-fixing role, where this is understood not as a kind of Frank Jackson-style primary intention that we know a priori, but in terms of the way our use of the concept contributes to the success of our practice. And that too, he thinks, is an a posteriori matter, not amenable to conceptual analysis. For participants in the practice can be mistaken about what they accomplish and how. Given this, we avoid a worry for simpler forms of analytic naturalism, where we might find ourselves committed to saying that those with different moral views simply talk past each other. On the contrary, such disputing parties are all talking about goodness in just the way that people who disagree about the chemical constitution of water are all, whether they know it or not, talking about H2O. Boyd's understanding of the methodology of moral theorizing is actually pretty conventional. He thinks its core method is the method of reflective equilibrium, as canonically described by John Rawls and Norman Daniels. Naturally here, reflective equilibrium is wide, drawing not just on considerations native to ethics, but on science and the rest of philosophy. As Boyd notes, this might seem an unsatisfactory position for a rigorous naturalist to take. Surely reflective equilibrium is too presupposition-laden to be a method of discovery. Surely it's more at home in a meta-ethical theory of a... Sorry, could you put that back to where it was? I pressed the button by mistake. Where was I? Surely it's more at home in a meta-ethical theory of a more modest, constructivist, response-dependent kind. But Boyd thinks this concern can be tamed, again, if he can answer his question correctly, satisfactorily. Again, he thinks there's no difference from the practice of science, where again our theoretical practice is heavily theory-dependent. In science, that's okay, because we have warrant to be confident in the approximate truth of our best current theories. A warrant that derives from the theoretical and practical success of scientific theorizing throughout its history. Boyd stresses that our reliance on reflective equilibrium is far from entailing that our ethical knowledge is not genuinely experimental. Remember, reflective equilibrium is wide. Political and social history, for example, is a central source of data. Thus, for example, we understand the dimensions of our needs for artistic expression because there have been cultures with the leisure to explore them. And the development of early democracies helps us understand the role of democracy in the homeostasis of the good. But this whole picture again requires that we're able to say what plays the role in moral reasoning that observation plays in science, to which, as we've seen, Boyd's answer is observation. After all, goodness, as understood by homeostatic consequentialism, is a natural property out there in plain view, no less observable than any other. But there are problems here. Boyd thinks himself that we can vindicate his realist understanding of moral inquiry along lines he takes to be analogous to the case of science by seeing moral terms as referring to whatever candidate moral properties best explain the success of moral practice in achieving its aims. But it's not at all clear that the parallel is convincing, that we really have in moral inquiry a narrative of achievement relevantly comparable to what we can point to in science. Of course, a lot has happened over the years in the way of social and cultural change, and perhaps some of what has happened has been shaped, for better or for worse, by the work of moral theorists, French philosophes, English philosophical radicals, that guy Marx, etc., where the work of these theorists has perhaps clarified, focused, and developed, perhaps in some cases corrupted, our central moral ideas. But there seems to be not much in this narrative of a kind to make constructivist or other anti-realist understanding of ethics look simply quixotic, in a way that most of us would surely agree that similarly constructivist understandings of the causal order of physical nature do look simply quixotic. Moreover, what is to count as success in the progress in the ethical case? Sorry, what is to count as success or as progress in the ethical case is surely so thoroughly theory dependent, and in ways that it's surely far from obvious are closely paralleled in the case of science, that a debilitating circularity threatens. Suppose we found ourselves in possession both of a TARDIS and of a Babelfish. For those of you who are innocent of pop science fiction, suppose we found ourselves in possession both of a time travel device and a universal translation device. We would then be in the nice position of being able to invite Plato and Aristotle round for tea. Anxious to impress them with the wonders of modern science, we tell them about light bulbs. We show them, as well as tell them about light bulbs, motor cars, atom bombs, aeroplanes, film, TV, space travel, computers, the possibilities of modern medicine. Gee, we might expect them to say, you guys are onto something. There has to be something in all that physics, chemistry and stuff that you do, or how else could all this stuff work? And note that their warrant for being impressed is very theory independent. To be impressed with a scientific culture that has mastered air travel, you don't need to know much mechanics. Only enough mechanics to know that mastering air travel is pretty damn hard. And Plato and Aristotle, for all their deep ignorance of modern mechanics, knew that. But now our conversation turns to ethics, and we tell Plato and Aristotle how slavery has ceased to be a morally acceptable practice. And while not quite rooted out, sadly, it's more or less illegal, more or less everywhere. We tell them how democracy has grown and spread and developed, and opposition to it has come to be more or less morally disreputable. But we wouldn't expect them, we wouldn't then expect Aristotle, who rather approved of slavery, to be much impressed. And we would expect Plato, who positively deplored democracy, to be positively appalled. As our moral thought has evolved, we have come to disapprove of slavery and celebrate democracy, and our moral practice has kept roughly in step. Our history might have been different. We might have come to love slavery more and more, and to deplore democracy. If in consequence slavery and autocracy had come to be ever more widespread, we would look back on our history as one of steady moral progress. But that would hardly be the sort of vindication Boyd is after. This heavily theory-dependent standard of success in this context surely strips such success of the capacity to do much confirmatory heavy lifting. Boyd still has some things to say. He thinks that what counts as an achievement depends on expert judgment and depends also on the aims of our practice. But I think the worry is just enhanced insofar as Boyd tends to characterise the aims of moral inquiry itself in practical, normative, substantively moral terms. I myself think it's right to characterise the aims of moral inquiry in substantively moral terms, but then I'm not a naturalistic realist, and I don't think that's a problem for me. I do think it's a problem for him. Here he strikes a rather modest note, suggesting that we may see ethical theory as in effect in the business of offering hypothetical imperatives. Theories of the nature of the good, etc., have just the same, I'm quoting, hypothetical normative import as do our theories of the natures of chemical kinds. If you want to achieve the aims of moral practice, classify things this way. No doubt there could be many such classificatory schemes, corresponding to many competing putative such aims. The question then is whether the choice of aim Boyd would favour can be said to be correct, where correctness is to be understood in the sort of robustly naturalistic, realist spirit that would be consonant with Boyd's ethical theory. Intriguingly, these various schemes on Boyd's account might come to seem strikingly akin to the systems of thick moral concepts possessed by wholly unreflective, hyper-traditional societies, as conceived by Bernard Williams. Williams allows that the application of moral concepts can yield real knowledge, but distinguishes such knowledge sharply from anything that would address the reflective questions that arise when we stand back from these determinate conceptual structures and attempt to evaluate them and determine which furnish the best form of human life. But this reflective enterprise, one about which Williams himself is rather pessimistic, is an essential and far from completed aspect of moral inquiry. And it's the part where appeals to intuition appear to play the most pervasive and troublingly central role. The analogy is borne out by Boyd's rather deflationary take on the critical stance that Robert Adams has alleged his naturalism is ill-suited to accommodate. Boyd's lengthy discussion of this objection concludes by suggesting a division of labour, a division between, on the one hand, investigations of the metaphysics of morals, of which his naturalistic metaethics are an account, and an in principle distinct process whereby we satisfy ourselves that the reference of good and similarly approbative moral terms are things we actually admire. He doesn't tell us much about the latter process, but this robustly deflationary characterization of it seems to align him in the end rather more with the constructivist camp than he started out intending. Ultimately then, my problem with Boyd's naturalism is continuous with my problem with the less sophisticated naturalism on offer from Harris. The practice of moral reflection may lead us to believe that goodness is realized by some natural property, coit ng, and rightness by some natural property, coit nr. Ng, the goodness realizing property, might be what Boyd thinks it is, a homeostatic bundle of properties relevant to human needs. It might be what Moore thinks it is, experiences of aesthetic beauty and close interpersonal friendship. It might be something else. Once we've satisfied ourselves of its being whatever it turns out to be, it's then the business of the various human sciences to tell us how to put this moral understanding in practice, to tell us what things actually have ng, what actions and policies actually have nr. Once we've so satisfied ourselves, all the rest is empirical and can be naturalized all the way down. But the process of getting to that point, a process which I take to be the distinctive métier of moral philosophers, is something else. Something empirical investigation, centrally regulated by scientific observation, should be expected to constrain and to inform, but cannot be expected to settle. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
So I wanted to ask you about, in your conversation with Plato and Aristotle, you deploy a counterfactual situation in which we end up finding morally good slavery in the 20th century, and that's supposed to be a problem for Boyd, if I got you right. I don't see how. So one way to understand homeostatic property clusters is as individuals. So these things are, as mammals are, individuals. Things that begin at some point, with the dawn of humankind, and go on the way they go up until now. Had we gone some other route, then there would have been other things, but not goodness. And we would have called those other things good, but we would be using different words, because these things are individuals, and we should think of them de re, so to say. So that would be, I take a response on behalf of Boyd. I don't know what you think of that.
I don't really see how it engages with the...
Sorry?
I don't really see how it engages with the
you say,
concern.
Had the world be taken different turns at different crucial points, we would have ended up thinking of slavery as good. But that's a false counterfactual.
There could have been a different moral history.
That's a false counterfactual.
And if we'd had a different moral history here, we'd all be now thinking, isn't slavery brilliant? Isn't democracy rubbish? And we'd have lots of slaves, and we'd be governed by an absolute dictator, and we'd think this was pretty good. We could have had a different scientific history, and we could have produced quite different theories about mechanics, and quite different theories about chemistry, and quite different theories about physics, and in consequence we could have built lots of airplanes that don't fly, and developed lots of medicines that don't cure illnesses. The second of these counterfactuals would be a case of failure. We'd have messed things up, and we can see, there's a theory-independent way we can see that that's right, because the airplanes don't fly. There is no such theory-independent way of diagnosing the alternative moral history as a history of failure. And I think for Boyd there needs to be, and I don't see how... that's the central point, and I don't see how what you say is really upsetting it. Because Boyd needs to be able to say that, what's ultimately pinning all this down is a narrative of success.
Okay.
Or I can go on.
Yeah, maybe. Any further questions? Yeah, Tom.
I'm afraid I don't know Boyd's writings well enough, but it would look as though a great deal rests on human needs, and in a way, as your own comments suggested, needs are plainly highly normative. What's necessary for us? Well, necessary for a good life, necessary for continued existence, and so on. So I wasn't sure whether the naturalism that embraces emotional need, whether it hasn't helped itself to a great deal of what it was supposed to be explaining in the first place.
Yes. I think there's an obvious presupposition in your question, which is that the notion of needs is normative. Of course, that's controversial. I mean, it's the notion of needs is like the notion of well-being. I mean, some philosophers think well-being, needs, these are concepts which already carry huge amounts of normative charge. Other people think that these are notions that can have satisfactory naturalistic definitions. Not necessarily satisfactory naturalistic conceptual analysis, but at least satisfactory naturalistic reforming definitions that will then play the appropriate role in whatever naturalistic moral theory they want to develop. I don't need to take sides, I don't think, in that dispute, but a naturalist like Boyd, I think, is certainly going to be philosophically, he's going to make his philosophical life easier if he can make a case for the second understanding, if he can make a case that needs can be, Tolkien needs can be understood naturalistically in that way.
So can I just come back? When you say that naturalistic definition, I mean, does naturalistic exclude normative then? Because if it does, then I don't see how you can have NG and NR. And if it doesn't, then I don't see what the point of your response to me was.
Right. Well, if you're a naturalist, naturalistic doesn't exclude normative because the normative is natural.
Exactly.
But if you're the sort of naturalist that tries to defend the claim that the normative is natural in the way that people standardly do, by explaining how paradigmatically normative concepts can be understood in terms of paradigmatically natural ones, or in the case of a non-reductive naturalist or a non-analytic naturalist like Boyd, explaining how the properties we pick out with paradigmatically normative concepts can be thought to be realized by the properties that we pick out by paradigmatically natural concepts, then you want the stuff that's the exponents to be as naturalistic as possible. And if I say, look, here's my defense of naturalism, take this clearly normative concept, rightness, and I'm going to explain how we can understand rightness talk in terms of goodness talk. That's not very impressive. That's still inside the circle of the normative. Whereas if I say, look, I can understand rightness talk in terms of neurology, that's progress. So to that extent, if we think that the concept of needs comes with normative baggage, that's a problem for the naturalist, even though the naturalist doesn't distinguish between the normative and the natural in the way that old-fashioned advocates of a fact-value distinction would distinguish between those things. Is that less unsatisfactory?
Less.
Progress.
Okay, does anyone have one last question?
I guess, it seems whenever you're doing science, your conceptual frameworks are going to shape how you articulate your results, how you pose your questions, what data you observe, and so on. And that leads to all sorts of complications, and I just don't understand how, in the context of moral questions, you could even begin to think that you could get out of that problem and get some answers that are going to be useful through experiment and so on in such a way that your results would be determinative of morals. Informative of morals, okay, but just say we took an experimental approach and I pick Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin, and so on as my experimental subjects and so on, and I get certain kinds of data. It's obviously going to be skewed in a way that's going to throw off the acceptance of my results, such that I'm going to have to use some sort of pre-experimental discrimination in order to, sort out who it is that I'm going to be experimenting on, what kinds of questions, and I'm just, I'm coming from somewhere far different, and I'm just thinking, look, how could you even take seriously in the first place that you wouldn't need some pre-experimental, pre-empirical orientation toward the good, etc., in order to get your empirical program off the ground and get things going the right way in the first place.
I think you're agreeing with me.
Yes,
sort of.
yes.
I take Boyd pretty seriously because I think he's doing as good a job as anyone out there is doing in trying to make some sense of how this kind of moral naturalism can be true. I don't take Sam Harris all that seriously, but I thought that Sam Harris was a nice was sort of making the same mistake, but in a much cruder way that made it easier to diagnose the mistake that Boyd was making in a much more subtle way. I mean, there are, and I've been a bit disparaging of Harris, but there is much more interesting stuff going on in experimental ethics. I don't want to dismiss it altogether, and there are people who make large claims. I mean, notoriously, Joshua Green and his chums at Harvard have all kinds of experimental data where they think that they can show experimentally that deontological intuitions about trolley cases and things like that are driven by or emotional responses we have whereby we're much more reluctant to kill people in up-close and personal ways than we are to kill people in kind of remote distance ways. So if you can avert some catastrophe by beating me to death, even if I find that really hard to do, whereas if you can avert some catastrophe by pressing a button which will cause me to be atomized far away, that's easy. And he thinks that's what's at work in driving deontological intuitions. Now, and he thinks that shows that deontological intuitions are disreputable on empirical grounds. How that argument works. There's actually loads of reasons to doubt that argument works. There's a super paper by Salim Barker in a recent Philosophy and Public Affairs called The Normative Irrelevance of Neuroscience, which argues very persuasively that these arguments don't show what he thinks they do. But even if that argument worked, of course it is driven by moral intuition. The moral intuition that drives it is that although we might be, as a matter of psychological fact, influenced by, as it were, the up-closeness and personalness of killing or harming people, actually that's morally irrelevant. When we reflect, we think, it may be easier for you to kill me by pressing a button than for you to physically beat me to death, but actually there isn't a moral difference between those two things. And that moral intuition is driving Harris's claims, is driving Green's claims about what he thinks his experimental data shows. So even in that case, which is perhaps the most sort of interesting of the various things that experimentalists have argued, we haven't managed to, as it were, naturalise all the way down. It's still influencing, it's still informing, but it sure as hell ain't determining.
Okay, with that, we should say thank you to Jimmy for an excellent discussion.